You replay conversations from hours or days or years ago, analyzing what you said and what they said and what you should have said, finding new meanings in old interactions, discovering threats or slights or implications that you did not notice at the time but that now seem obvious and concerning. You make simple decisions into complex analyses, weighing options and considering possibilities and imagining outcomes until the choice that should have taken minutes has consumed hours or days and still feels unresolved. You plan conversations that may never happen, rehearse responses to criticisms that have not been made, prepare defenses for attacks that exist only in your imagination. This is overthinking, the exhausting mental loop that transforms simple experiences into complex problems, that finds danger in ordinary situations, that creates anxiety where none existed, that prevents action through excessive analysis, that makes life harder than it needs to be through constant cognitive elaboration of what should be straightforward. You cannot seem to stop even when you recognize that the thinking is not productive, that you are not discovering new insights but are simply recycling the same thoughts in slightly different configurations, that you are making yourself anxious without solving anything. The overthinking is not occasional problem but is constant background process, is how your mind relates to reality by default, is orientation toward experience characterized by inability to accept things as they are without subjecting them to elaborate examination. You cannot simply have a conversation without analyzing it afterward. You cannot make a choice without second-guessing it. You cannot receive feedback without obsessing over what it means. You cannot let things go without returning to them again and again in your mind. Understanding why you overthink everything requires examining what drives this tendency, what psychological needs it serves, why it persists despite causing obvious suffering. Overthinking is driven primarily by anxiety, by the belief that if you think about something long enough and thoroughly enough, you can control the outcome, can prevent bad things from happening, can find the perfect solution that eliminates all risk and uncertainty. The thinking feels productive because it creates illusion of doing something, of preparing, of protecting yourself from potential threats that careful analysis might prevent or mitigate. But the thinking rarely produces actual solutions and instead generates more questions, more possibilities, more things to worry about. The anxiety underneath overthinking is often about uncertainty and lack of control. You cannot tolerate not knowing what will happen, cannot accept that some outcomes are beyond your influence, cannot make peace with the reality that careful analysis does not eliminate risk or guarantee good results. So you think and analyze and plan as way of managing the anxiety, as attempt to create certainty where none exists, as method of feeling like you are doing something productive when actually you are just avoiding the discomfort of not knowing. The overthinking also serves perfectionism, the belief that there is right answer or perfect choice or ideal approach, and that if you just think hard enough you will find it, that mistakes can be avoided through sufficient analysis, that you can optimize every decision if you consider it from enough angles. This perfectionism makes simple choices paralyzing because every option has potential downsides, because no choice is obviously superior, because you can always imagine ways that any decision might lead to regret. But perfectionism is defense against the anxiety of being wrong, against the shame of making mistakes, against the vulnerability of acting without certainty that the action is correct. The overthinking protects you from this vulnerability by creating permanent analysis mode where you never have to commit, never have to risk being wrong, never have to face the consequences of imperfect choice, because you are always still deciding, always still considering, always not quite ready to act. The thinking also fills time and provides distraction from other anxieties or difficult emotions you are avoiding. It is easier to obsess about what someone meant by their comment than to face the loneliness or the grief or the emptiness that would emerge if you stopped thinking and allowed yourself to feel what you are actually feeling beneath the constant mental activity. The overthinking is noise that drowns out the signal, is defense that prevents you from confronting what you are actually afraid of or avoiding. Overthinking is also an attempt to process unresolved emotions or experiences that you never fully dealt with, that remain psychologically active because they were never metabolized, never integrated, never given proper attention when they occurred. The conversation you keep replaying is the one where something important happened that you did not process at the time, where you felt something you could not acknowledge, where there was emotional content that remains undigested and keeps pulling your attention back because the psyche is trying to complete what was left incomplete. The thinking becomes compulsive because you are trying to think your way through something that actually needs to be felt, are trying to analyze your way to resolution of something that requires emotional processing rather than intellectual understanding. But you cannot think your way out of feelings, cannot analyze your way to emotional closure, cannot resolve through cognition what needs to be addressed through actually experiencing and integrating the emotion that the situation activated. This confusion between thinking and feeling creates endless loop where you think about the situation trying to resolve it, but thinking does not resolve it because resolution requires feeling the sadness or anger or hurt or fear that you are avoiding, requires allowing the emotion to be present and to complete rather than trying to understand your way around it. The overthinking is avoidance disguised as engagement, is mental activity that looks productive but actually prevents the emotional work that would actually bring closure. The overthinking also creates the very problems it is trying to prevent. The excessive analysis of social interactions creates awkwardness and self-consciousness that makes future interactions more difficult. The constant second-guessing of decisions creates paralysis that leads to missed opportunities and to the very regrets you were trying to avoid. The obsessive planning creates anxiety about things that have not happened and may never happen, creates suffering in advance of events that might not occur or might not be as difficult as you imagined. You are not protecting yourself through the overthinking but are actually creating additional suffering, are making life harder through the constant analysis, are generating anxiety through the relentless examination of everything that could go wrong. The thinking that is supposed to make you feel more prepared and more in control actually makes you feel less prepared and less in control because it reveals endless possibilities for failure or harm that you had not considered, creates awareness of risks and uncertainties that you might not have noticed if you were not thinking so obsessively. Overthinking is often rooted in low self-trust, in the belief that you cannot rely on your own judgment, that your initial instincts are probably wrong, that you need to check and recheck and analyze because your natural responses are not adequate or trustworthy. This lack of self-trust often comes from experiences where you were told your perceptions were wrong, where your feelings were dismissed or invalidated, where you learned that what you thought or felt could not be trusted and needed to be constantly examined and corrected. When you do not trust yourself, every decision becomes anxiety-inducing because you have no internal compass you believe in, no sense that you can make reasonable choices based on your own assessment, no confidence that your judgment is valid. So you think obsessively trying to find the objectively correct answer from outside yourself, trying to eliminate all possibility of error, trying to protect yourself from the consequences of trusting yourself and being wrong. The overthinking also creates identity, gives you something to do, that makes you feel like you are the kind of person who thinks deeply and carefully, rather than accepting that you might just be an anxious person who cannot make decisions. It is easier to see yourself as a thoughtful analyst than as someone paralyzed by fear of making mistakes. Easier to frame the overthinking as intellectual rigor rather than as psychological dysfunction. Easier to maintain image of being careful and conscientious than to acknowledge that you are simply afraid. This identification with overthinking makes it harder to stop, because stopping would mean giving up an aspect of how you see yourself, would require acknowledging that what you thought was a valuable trait is actually creating suffering. You have built identity around being a person who thinks things through, who considers all angles, who does not act impulsively. And letting go of the overthinking would feel like becoming someone you are not, like losing important part of yourself even when that part is causing obvious problems. The overthinking also prevents presence, keeps you living in your head rather than in actual experience, makes you miss what is happening right now because you are analyzing what happened before or worrying about what might happen next. You are in conversation, but you are not actually present in the conversation because you are already analyzing what was just said, planning what you will say next, worrying about how you are being perceived. You are having experience, but you are not in the experience because you are already interpreting it, categorizing it, comparing it to other experiences, thinking about what it means rather than simply being in it. The overthinking is also an attempt to prevent repeating past mistakes, to ensure that you never again experience the shame or pain or consequences that you experienced before when you acted without sufficient thought, when you trusted your judgment and it led to outcomes you regret. Every mistake from the past becomes evidence that you need to think more carefully, that your natural instincts cannot be trusted, that you must analyze exhaustively to avoid repeating the errors that still haunt you. But this backward-looking analysis does not actually prevent future mistakes because new situations are different from past ones, because the specific factors that made something a mistake before may not be present now, because excessive caution creates its own problems that are as significant as the problems it prevents. The person who overthinks to avoid making wrong choice often makes different wrong choice of not choosing at all, of remaining stuck in analysis while opportunities pass, of letting paralysis create the very losses they were trying to prevent. The overthinking also becomes self-fulfilling prophecy where the anxiety it creates actually causes the problems you were worried about. You overthink the social interaction until you are so anxious and self-conscious that the interaction goes badly, which confirms your belief that you needed to think carefully about it, which makes you overthink the next interaction even more. You overthink the decision until you are so paralyzed that you miss the deadline or make hasty choice under pressure, which confirms that you are bad at decisions, which makes you overthink future decisions even more intensely. The pattern reinforces itself because the overthinking creates observable negative outcomes that seem to justify more overthinking, because you do not recognize that the thinking itself is creating the problems rather than preventing them, because each instance of overthinking followed by bad outcome is interpreted as evidence that you did not think enough or did not think about the right things, rather than as evidence that the overthinking itself is the problem. This creates a vicious cycle where overthinking leads to anxiety, leads to poor outcomes, leads to more overthinking, where each iteration makes the pattern stronger, makes it harder to break, makes it seem more necessary even as it becomes more destructive. You are trapped in a loop that you cannot see clearly because you are inside it, because the thinking itself prevents the perspective that would reveal that the thinking is the problem rather than the solution. Breaking the overthinking pattern requires first recognizing when you are doing it, which is harder than it seems because the thinking feels so compelling, so necessary, so productive in the moment. You must learn to distinguish between productive thinking that actually moves toward understanding or solution and rumination, that is simply recycling the same thoughts without progress, that is creating anxiety without creating clarity, that is mental activity mistaken for meaningful work. Productive thinking has forward momentum, generates new insights, leads toward decisions or actions or genuine understanding. Rumination is circular, returns to the same points repeatedly, does not produce new information or perspective, continues indefinitely without reaching resolution. The difference is often obvious in retrospect, but is hard to see while you are in it because the rumination feels like you are on the verge of breakthrough. Like if you just think about it a little more, you will finally understand or decide or resolve. Learning to catch yourself requires developing observer awareness, the part of consciousness that can notice what the mind is doing without being completely identified with the thinking, that can recognize rumination as rumination rather than as productive analysis. This is not easy because the thinking is automatic, feels necessary, captures attention completely. But with practice, you can develop the capacity to notice when you have been thinking about the same thing for the third or fourth or 10th time, when the thinking has become loop rather than progression. The recognition itself does not stop the overthinking, but creates space where choice becomes possible, where you can decide whether to continue the thinking or to deliberately shift attention elsewhere, where you can interrupt the pattern rather than being carried along by it unconsciously. This interruption is first step toward change. Is the moment where you are no longer completely possessed by the thinking, but have some relationship to it, some distance from it, some capacity to choose whether to engage or disengage. But the interruption only works if you have alternative to the thinking, if you have something else to do with your attention that is more compelling or satisfying than continuing the rumination. Simply trying to stop thinking does not work, because it creates vacuum that the mind rushes to fill with more thinking, because suppression of thoughts tends to intensify them rather than eliminate them, because you need to redirect attention rather than trying to create blank mind through force of will. The alternatives that work best are activities that engage attention fully enough that thinking cannot continue in parallel, that require presence rather than allowing the mind to wander into familiar ruminative loops. Physical activity often works because the body's demands can override the thinking, can bring attention into sensation and movement rather than remaining in abstract mental analysis. Creative activities that require focus, conversation that demands actual listening rather than planning your next response, tasks that are engaging enough to capture attention completely, all these can interrupt the overthinking by giving the mind something else to do. But these alternatives only address the symptom, only interrupt the thinking temporarily without addressing why you overthink in the first place. The deeper work requires addressing the underlying anxiety, the perfectionism, the low self-trust, the unprocessed emotions, the need for control that drive the compulsive analysis. This means learning to tolerate uncertainty without needing to think your way to false certainty, learning to trust your judgment even when you cannot guarantee the outcome will be perfect, learning to feel emotions rather than thinking about them. The self-trust develops gradually through practice of making decisions without excessive analysis and discovering that you survive the outcomes, that imperfect choices do not destroy you, that your judgment is adequate even when it is not perfect. Each time you make reasonably quick decision and it works out okay, or even when it does not work out but you handle the consequences, you build evidence that overthinking is not necessary, that you can trust yourself to navigate life without constant elaborate analysis. The emotional work requires learning to recognize when thinking is covering for feeling, when analysis is defense against emotions you do not want to experience. When you catch yourself obsessing about something, stop and ask what you are actually feeling beneath the thoughts, what emotion is present that the thinking is helping you avoid. Then allow yourself to feel it directly rather than continuing to think about it. Allow the sadness or fear or anger to be present without trying to analyze it or understand it or make it make sense. This feeling is often brief if you allow it directly, often resolves quickly when it is not being avoided, often brings the closure that thinking never could. The situation you have been obsessing about for days might resolve emotionally in minutes if you stop thinking about it and simply feel what it made you feel. If you allow the hurt or disappointment or fear to exist and complete, rather than defending against it through endless analysis. Breaking the overthinking habit also requires accepting that some questions do not have answers, that some situations cannot be fully understood, that some uncertainty cannot be eliminated through analysis, no matter how thorough. You must learn to live with not knowing, to make peace with ambiguity, to act despite uncertainty rather than waiting for the clarity that may never come. This acceptance is not resignation, but is recognition of reality, is acknowledging that perfect information is rare, and that waiting for it means never acting, never moving forward, remaining stuck in perpetual analysis. The acceptance also means recognizing that mistakes are inevitable and survivable, that you will make wrong choices sometimes regardless of how much you think about them, that the goal is not to eliminate all errors, but to make reasonable decisions and handle the consequences when things do not work out perfectly. The perfectionism that drives overthinking is based on fantasy, that perfect choice is possible if you just think carefully enough. But this fantasy creates paralysis and suffering while pursuing impossible standard. Practicing decision-making without overthinking means setting time limits, giving yourself specific amount of time to consider a choice, and then deciding when the time is up, regardless of whether you feel completely certain. Start with small decisions where stakes are low, where making imperfect choice will not have serious consequences, and practice making them quickly based on initial instinct rather than elaborate analysis. Notice that you survive these quick decisions, that the outcomes are usually fine, that the time saved from not overthinking is valuable even when the decision is not optimal. The practice builds capacity for faster decision-making with larger choices, builds evidence that you can trust your judgment, builds confidence that overthinking is not necessary for acceptable outcomes. You discover that the decisions you make quickly are often as good as or better than decisions you agonize over for days, that the overthinking does not actually improve the quality of choices but only creates suffering in the process of making them. The final and most important recognition is that overthinking is choice, is habit you have developed that can be undeveloped, is pattern you are maintaining that you can change. You are not victim of your mind, but are participant in what your mind does, and you can learn different ways of relating to thoughts, different responses to uncertainty, different methods of making decisions that do not require the exhausting analysis that has characterized your approach to life until now. Conclusion: you overthink everything because anxiety drives you to seek control through analysis, because perfectionism makes you believe there is right answer you will find if you think long enough, because low self-trust makes every decision feel risky, because unprocessed emotions keep pulling your attention back to situations that were never emotionally resolved, because overthinking has become identity and familiar pattern that feels safer than the alternative of trusting yourself and acting despite uncertainty. The overthinking creates the very problems it is meant to prevent. The analysis generates anxiety. The constant second guessing creates paralysis. The excessive planning prevents presence. The rumination makes situations more difficult than they would be if you responded naturally, rather than thinking obsessively about every interaction and every choice. You are not protecting yourself, but are creating additional suffering, are making life harder through the pattern that feels necessary but is actually optional. Stopping the overthinking requires recognizing when you are doing it, distinguishing productive thinking from rumination, developing alternatives that redirect attention, addressing the underlying anxiety and perfectionism and low self-trust that drive the pattern. It requires learning to tolerate uncertainty, to feel emotions rather than thinking about them, to make decisions without exhaustive analysis, to trust your judgment even when outcomes are not guaranteed. The change happens gradually through practice, through making quicker decisions and surviving the outcomes, through catching yourself in rumination and choosing to interrupt it, through feeling emotions directly rather than avoiding them through analysis, through accepting that some questions have no answers and some situations cannot be fully understood. Each instance of choosing differently weakens the overthinking habit and strengthens the capacity for presence and direct engagement with experience rather than constant mental elaboration of what should be straightforward. The overthinking is not permanent condition, but is learned pattern that can be unlearned, is habit you develop that you can replace with different habits, is choice you make repeatedly that you can begin making differently. You can learn to think less and feel more, to analyze less and trust more, to plan less and be present more, to live in experience rather than in constant mental commentary about experience.